Welcome back, everyone, to Rambling Dan Rose Deep Dive Book Reviews. We're glad to have you with us. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into this book, The Insider's Game, How Elites Make War and Peace by Elizabeth N. Saunders. And it's a fascinating look at how decisions about war and peace are made, often a lot more political maneuvering than we might realize.
Yeah, this book really flips the script on this idea that public opinion is like the primary driver of foreign policy.
Right, right. Before we jump into the specifics, can you give us a little background on Elizabeth Saunders? What's her expertise, and why should we trust her take on this topic?
So Saunders is a political scientist. She's at the University of Virginia. Her research focuses on international relations, particularly on the role of domestic politics in shaping foreign policy decisions.
Okay, so she's not just an armchair theorist. She's got the academic chops to back up her argument.
Exactly. And what's great about this book is that it's not just dry theory. Saunders brings in these compelling case studies, Vietnam, Korea, Lebanon, Iraq, to illustrate her points. It's like getting a behind-the-scenes peek at how presidents actually make these weighty decisions.
I love it. Yeah, so let's unpack this insider's game concept. In Chapter 1, Saunders introduces this idea and contrasts it with the more traditional models of democratic accountability. What's the core argument here?
So the traditional view suggests that in a democracy, leaders are primarily constrained by public opinion. If the public doesn't want war, leaders won't go to war. Saunders argues that it's much more complicated than that.
So it's not as simple as the people speak and the leaders follow.
Not at all. Saunders says that democratic leaders are heavily influenced by a select group of insiders. So we're talking legislators, high-ranking officials, military leaders, even influential members of the media. These are the folks that have the president's ear, and their opinions carry a lot of weight.
Yeah. I can see how that would make sense. These insiders have access to information that the general public doesn't. They're also the ones who control the levers of power. The budgets, the troops, the intelligence.
Right, and they often have their own agendas, their own political ambitions, and their own ideologies that shape their views on war and peace.
In Chapter 2, Saunders dives deeper into these dynamics, laying out two main models of constraint in democracies. Can you walk us through those?
Yeah, so she contrasts the faithful intermediaries model with the insider's game model. The faithful intermediaries model is that classic view of democratic accountability. The public has preferences about foreign policy, and elected officials act as faithful intermediaries carrying out those preferences.
Okay, it sounds nice in theory, but does it actually work that way in practice?
That's where Saunders throws some serious shade. She argues that voters face some pretty big challenges when it comes to influencing foreign policy decisions. For one, it's hard for them to coordinate and express their preferences in a way that policymakers can easily understand. It's not like everyone gets a vote on whether to go to war.
Right, and even if they could coordinate, do voters really have the time or expertise to fully understand the nuances of complex foreign policy issues? I mean, most of us are busy just trying to get through the day.
Exactly, and that's another point Saunders makes. Voters often lack access to the same information that insiders have. They're relying on what they see in the media, which can be biased or incomplete. Meanwhile, insiders are getting classified briefings, intelligence reports, expert analysis.
So they're playing the game with a totally different set of cards.
Right, and that's where the insider's game model comes in. Saunders argues that it's the interactions and bargains among these elites that really shape decisions about war and peace.
Just briefly, we want to say thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rose Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please remember to like and subscribe to support our channel. Thank you. Okay, so walk us through how this insider's game actually plays out. Does it always lead to war?
So Saunders argues that the insider's game often creates a hawkish bias in decisions about using military force. This is where the concept of the dove's curse comes in. Doves, those who oppose military action, face a higher cost for acting true to type compared to hawks.
What do you mean by cost? What are the consequences for a dove who speaks out against war?
They might be seen as weak, naive, or even unpatriotic, especially during times of heightened national security concerns. And this can have real consequences for their careers. They might be passed over for promotions, lose committee assignments, or even face primary challenges from more hawkish members of their party.
It sounds like there's a real pressure to conform, especially if you're in a position where you need to maintain the support of powerful people who lean towards military intervention.
Exactly, and that pressure can be really hard to resist, even if you genuinely believe that war is the wrong course of action.
So how does Saunders back up this argument? Is it just based on anecdotal evidence, or does she bring in some hard data?
This is where Chapter 3 gets really interesting. Saunders presents evidence from a series of survey experiments that she conducted to show how elite cues can sway public opinion.
So she's not just speculating, she's actually testing these ideas. What did she find?
She found that even small shifts in public perception can have significant implications for political calculations. For example, she found that respondents were more likely to support military intervention if they believed that key members of Congress supported it, even if they didn't necessarily agree with those members' overall political views.
So it's not just about the substance of the argument, it's about who's making the argument. People are looking for cues from those they trust, even if those cues are leading them towards the position they might not otherwise support.
And that's really important because it undermines the idea that the public is carefully weighing the pros and cons of military intervention based on objective information. They're often relying on shortcuts, on cues from trusted elites to make sense of complex issues.
And this can be really dangerous because it means that leaders can manipulate public opinion by carefully managing those elite cues, by getting the right people to say the right things, even if those things aren't entirely true or accurate.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? It suggests that even in a democracy, public opinion can be molded and shaped by those in power.
I'm curious to see how this plays out in the specific case studies that Saunders examines. Before we move on to those, I want to touch on one point that stood out to me from the early chapters. Saunders includes examples of how poorly informed the public can be on basic facts related to war, even during major conflicts.
Yeah, she uses the example of public knowledge about troop levels in Iraq. In her surveys, she found that even after major events like the surge or the withdrawal, a significant portion of the public had no idea how many troops were actually on the ground.
And that was despite extensive media coverage of the war. It's both surprising and alarming, isn't it?
It is, and it really underscores the importance of understanding how those elite cues can shape public perception, even in the absence of accurate information.
So we've got this theoretical framework of the insider's game, and some evidence suggesting that it actually has a real impact on public opinion. Now let's get into the meat of the book and see how this plays out in some specific historical cases.
Right, so Saunders brings this framework to life with deep dives into 4 major conflicts: the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Lebanon intervention, and the Iraq War. She analyzes how presidents navigated the insider's game in each of these cases, dealing with the pressures and constraints of elite politics. It's fascinating to see how those dynamics influence decisions to escalate, de-escalate, and ultimately withdraw from these conflicts.
Okay, so let's start with the Korean War. In Chapter 4, Saunders takes us into Harry Truman's decision-making process. This was a really pivotal moment in U.S. foreign policy, where the Cold War was heating up, and the decision to intervene in Korea was a major gamble.
Absolutely, and as we discussed earlier, Truman was a Democrat facing the Dubs curse. He had to be especially careful not to appear weak on national security.
The book really highlights how Truman had to navigate those political pressures.
Yeah.
Can you give us some specific examples of how the insider's game played out in this case?
One of the most striking examples is the debate over crossing the 38th parallel, the line that divided North and South Korea. Initially, the goal was to push back the North Korean invasion and restore the pre-war boundary. But as the war progressed, there was growing pressure from hawkish figures, particularly General Douglas MacArthur, to push further north and potentially unify the entire Korean peninsula under a non-communist government.
MacArthur was a powerful figure, both militarily and politically. He had a lot of public support, and he wasn't shy about using that influence to put pressure on Truman.
Exactly. He was a master of the insider's game. And Saunders argues that Truman, despite his own reservations, eventually felt compelled to authorize MacArthur to cross the 38th parallel.
That decision had huge consequences, didn't it?
It brought China into the war, turning what had been a limited conflict into a much larger and more dangerous one, and it ultimately led to a stalemate that persists to this day.
It's a stark example of how elite pressure can lead to decisions that might not be in the best interests of the country or the world.
And it also highlights how personal rivalries and political maneuvering can shape those decisions. Truman and MacArthur had a very tense relationship, and their clashes ultimately contributed to Truman's decision to remove MacArthur from command.
It was a bold move, but it was also a risky one politically.
Yes. But Saunders argues that it was necessary to reassert civilian control over the military and to prevent the war from spiraling out of control.
So the Korean War is a case where the insider's game clearly had a major impact on the course of the conflict. But it also shows that presidents can, and sometimes must, push back against that pressure, even at significant political risk.
That's a really important point, and it suggests that the insider's game isn't always deterministic. Presidents still have agency, they still have choices to make, but they have to be willing to play the game strategically and to be prepared to face the consequences.
Now let's move on to Chapter 5, which focuses on the Vietnam War.
This is where Saunders examines Lyndon Johnson and his efforts to manage the escalating conflict while also pursuing his ambitious domestic agenda, the Great Society.
Johnson was a master politician,
Yeah.
known for his ability to wheel and deal and get things done. But even his political skills were put to the test by the Vietnam War.
The Vietnam War really exemplifies how the insider's game can lead to a prolonged and ultimately unsuccessful military intervention. And in this case, we see how Johnson, tried to maintain consensus, especially among hawkish figures in his own party and Congress, by engaging in a lot of behind-the-scenes bargaining and information management.
So even though he had doubts about the war, he felt trapped by those political pressures.
Exactly. He was worried about being seen as weak on communism, especially after Truman's experience in Korea. And remember, this is the height of the Cold War. There's this real fear of the domino effect, this idea that if one country falls to communism, others will follow.
Right. It's interesting how those historical events and political anxieties create a kind of feedback loop. The dove's curse becomes even stronger because of those past experiences.
Right, and that makes it even harder for a president to break free from that pattern. So Johnson used various tactics to keep those hawks on board. Saunders talks about how he used side payments, political favors, concessions on other policies, and promises of future support to keep key players happy.
Can you give us a concrete example of a side payment in this context? It's a term that might not be familiar to everyone.
Sure, so imagine a powerful senator who's on the fence about escalating the war in Vietnam. Johnson might offer to support that senator's pet project, like funding for a new highway in their state, in exchange for their vote on a bill authorizing more troops for Vietnam. It's a way of buying their support.
It's a classic political maneuver, but it can have some pretty serious consequences when it comes to decisions about war and peace.
Exactly, and it's not always about explicit quid pro quo deals. Sometimes it's more subtle. It might be about giving a key congressional leader a prominent role in the decision-making process, even if they don't have a lot of expertise on the issue. It makes them feel valued, included, and less likely to rock the boat.
So it's about managing those egos, those political ambitions, as much as it's about managing the actual policy.
Yes, and Johnson was a master at that kind of personal politics. But even the best political maneuvering can't always overcome the realities on the ground. As the Vietnam War dragged on and the casualties mounted, that strategy started to unravel.
Saunders mentions the Tet Offensive in 1968 as a major turning point. Can you remind us what happened and why it was so significant?
Yeah. So the Tet Offensive was a series of surprise attacks by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces across South Vietnam. It was a military defeat for the communists, but it was a huge psychological blow to the U.S. war effort. It exposed the gap between the administration's optimistic pronouncements about how well the war was going and the reality on the ground.
It shattered the narrative that the U.S. was winning the war.
Exactly. And it really shook public confidence and emboldened critics of the war, both within the administration and in Congress.
The book mentions that even some of Johnson's closest advisors, like Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, started to have serious doubts about the war.
Right, and that internal dissent made it even harder for Johnson to manage the insider's game. He had invested so much political capital in the war effort, and he was deeply concerned about the consequences of a U.S. defeat, both for his legacy and for the country's standing in the world. He became trapped by his own rhetoric, his own need to project strength and resolve.
Saunders argues that this is a classic example of how the insider's game can lead to a kind of inertia, even when a policy is clearly failing.
Yeah.
It's so hard to change course once you've committed so much to a particular path.
Yes, and the fear of appearing weak, of admitting a mistake, can be incredibly powerful, especially for a president.
So we see this pattern emerging, a president facing the dove's curse, engaging in the insider's game to build support for a war, and then becoming trapped by that dynamic even as the war goes sour.
It's a cycle that's hard to break, and it raises some really important questions about how we make decisions about war and peace.
Now let's shift gears and look at a very different kind of conflict. Ronald Reagan's intervention in Lebanon in the early 1980s. This case is explored in Chapter 6, and it seems to highlight the constraints even a Republican president can face when Congress is divided.
It does. Reagan, unlike Truman and Johnson, entered office with a much more hawkish reputation, but he still faced significant challenges in managing the insider's game, particularly when it came to the Lebanon intervention.
This intervention was part of a broader effort to bring stability to the region, right? It was a complex situation with a lot of different factions involved.
It was. And what's interesting about this case is that the administration struggled to manage the insider's game, even within their own ranks. There were internal disagreements about the mission's goals, and those disagreements hampered their ability to present a united front to Congress and the public.
The book mentions figures like Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, who had serious reservations about the mission.
Right. And those internal divisions made it much harder for Reagan to build and maintain support for the intervention. They also gave ammunition to critics in Congress, who were already skeptical of the mission.
Saunders highlights the negotiations over the War Powers Resolution as a key example of how those dynamics played out. Can you remind us what the War Powers Resolution is and why it was relevant in this case?
So the War Powers Resolution is a law that was passed in the aftermath of the Vietnam War to limit the president's ability to commit U.S. troops to hostilities without congressional approval. It requires the president to consult with Congress before deploying troops and to seek formal authorization within 60 days.
So it was an attempt by Congress to reassert its role in decisions about war and peace.
Exactly. And in the case of Lebanon, the War Powers Resolution became a major point of contention between the Reagan administration and Congress. The administration argued that they didn't need congressional authorization for the intervention, while many members of Congress, particularly Democrats, insisted that they did.
It sounds like a classic power struggle between the executive and legislative branches.
It was, and it highlights how the insider's game can play out not just within the executive branch, but also between the different branches of government.
So Reagan was facing pressure from within his own administration, from Congress. And then, of course, there were the events on the ground in Lebanon, which were becoming increasingly volatile.
Yes, and those events, particularly the bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983, which killed 241 American servicemen, really turned public opinion against the intervention.
It became a political liability for Reagan, and ultimately he decided to withdraw U.S. forces.
Right. It's interesting how this case contrasts with the Korean and Vietnam Wars. In those cases, we see Democratic presidents facing the Dub's curse and struggling to manage hawkish pressure. But in Lebanon, we see a Republican president typically associated with a more hawkish approach, facing constraints and ultimately being forced to retreat.
It shows that the insider's game isn't just about partisan politics. It's about the dynamics of power, the interplay of different actors, each with their own interests and agendas.
And it also demonstrates how events on the ground can sometimes override those political calculations. Even a president as popular and skilled as Reagan couldn't withstand the pressure of mounting casualties and a shifting public opinion.
Now let's move on to Chapter 7, which tackles the most recent case study, the Iraq War.
This chapter analyzes how the George W. Bush administration built consensus for the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and then later struggled to manage the conflict as it dragged on.
This case is particularly interesting because it took place in the aftermath of 9/11, a time of heightened national security concerns and strong public support for military action. You'd think that a Republican president wouldn't need to play the insider's game as much in that context.
You would think so, but Saunders argues that even in that environment, the Bush administration felt the need to build a broad coalition, both domestically and internationally. They wanted to make it seem like there was a real consensus behind the invasion, even though there were serious doubts and disagreements within the intelligence community and among foreign policy experts.
They were trying to create the perception of inevitability, of a united front against Saddam Hussein.
Exactly, and Saunders highlights some specific tactics they used to achieve that. One was emphasizing the perception that the war would be quick and easy, a cakewalk. This downplayed the potential risks and costs of the invasion and made it seem like a much less risky proposition.
They also made a big deal about Saddam Hussein's alleged weapons of mass destruction, which of course turned out to be a fabrication.
Right, that was a key part of their effort to build a case for war. They argued that Saddam Hussein posed an imminent threat to the United States and its allies, even though the intelligence on that was highly disputed.
And they brought in Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, to make that case to the United Nations.
Yes. Powell was a highly respected figure, and his endorsement of the war lent a lot of credibility to the administration's claims, even though he later admitted that his presentation to the UN was based on faulty intelligence. At the time, it had a significant impact on public opinion and on the international community's willingness to support the invasion.
So even though the context was different from the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the Bush administration still engaged in a form of the insider's game to build support for the Iraq War. They made strategic choices about how to frame the issue, who to bring on board, and what information to emphasize and downplay.
And those choices had profound consequences, both for the course of the war and for the long-term credibility of the U.S. government.
But the insider's game didn't end once the invasion began. Saunders also analyzes how the Bush administration later struggled to manage the conflict. As the situation in Iraq deteriorated and public support waned,
Right, once the initial euphoria of the invasion wore off and the reality of a long and bloody insurgency set in, the Bush administration faced a new set of challenges. They had to find a way to maintain support for the war, even as it became increasingly unpopular.
and this is where the 2007 surge decision comes in.
Yes, the surge was a major escalation of U.S. troop levels in Iraq. It was a gamble by the Bush administration, an attempt to turn the tide of the war and create the conditions for a successful withdrawal.
But it was a controversial decision, wasn't it? There was a lot of opposition both within the administration and in Congress.
There was public opinion had turned against the war, and even some of Bush's own advisors were skeptical of the surge.
So why did he do it?
Saunders argues that the surge was in part a response to the constraints that Bush was facing. He was losing support in Congress, and he was facing growing pressure to withdraw from Iraq.
So he escalated the war to avoid ending it.
In a sense, yes, the surge was a way of buying time, of trying to create a sense of momentum and progress that would allow him to hand off the war to his successor on more favorable terms.
It was a risky strategy, and it's debatable whether it ultimately succeeded.
It is, but it's a fascinating example of how a president, even one who's facing significant constraints, can still try to shape the course of events, even if those efforts involve escalating a war that many people believe should be ended.
So we've covered 4 very different case studies, spanning over half a century of U.S. foreign policy. What are some of the key takeaways that emerged from these examples? Are there any common threads that run through them?
I think one of the most striking takeaways is how persistent the dove's curse is, even for presidents from different parties and in different historical contexts. Whether it's Truman in Korea, Johnson in Vietnam, or even Reagan in Lebanon, we see this recurring pattern of Democratic presidents feeling compelled to take a hawkish stance to avoid being seen as weak.
It seems like there's a real structural bias in the American political system that makes it difficult for presidents, especially Democrats, to pursue a genuinely dovish foreign policy.
There does seem to be, and that bias has real consequences. It can lead to unnecessary wars, to prolonged conflicts, and to a reluctance to engage in diplomacy and other peaceful means of resolving disputes.
Another takeaway is that the insider's game is not always about pushing presidents towards war. In some cases, it can also act as a constraint, as we saw with Reagan in Lebanon. Elite pressure can make it difficult for presidents to escalate conflicts or to stay in them for too long, especially when public opinion turns against the war.
That's an important point. The insider's game is a complex and dynamic process, and it can play out in different ways depending on the specific context. But it always involves a struggle for power and influence, and it always has the potential to shape decisions about war and peace in profound ways.
It's interesting how the Iraq War case study sort of complicates the narrative. You might expect a Republican president, especially in the aftermath of 9/11, to have a much easier time building support for a war. But even the Bush administration felt the need to play the insider's game, to manufacture consensus and sell the war to the public.
Right, and that raises some important questions about the role of deception and manipulation in the insider's game. How much truth-telling are we willing to tolerate from our leaders? At what point does the need to manage political perceptions and maintain elite consensus cross the line into outright dishonesty?
It's a tricky balance, and it's one that we as citizens need to be constantly thinking about and debating.
Absolutely. And that brings us to Saunders' conclusion in Chapter 8, where she summarizes her findings and offers some broader reflections on the implications of the insider's game for democratic accountability in foreign policy.
So let's wrap up our deep dive into this book by focusing on those conclusions. What are the key takeaways, and what does Saunders leave us to ponder?
Yeah, so in her conclusion, Saunders argues that the insider's game, while a natural part of democratic politics, carries some inherent risks.
Okay, so let's get into those risks. What are the potential downsides of this insider's game when it comes to decisions about war and peace?
Well, one of the biggest risks is that leaders might prioritize elite interests over the broader public good, in their efforts to kind of manage the insider's game and maintain that elite consensus. They might make decisions that benefit a select few, even if those decisions harm the country as a whole or even the very people they claim to protect.
That's a sobering thought. It suggests that even in a democracy, the people in power can manipulate the system to serve their own interests, even if it means going to war when it's not in the national interest.
Yeah, and it's not always about overt corruption or personal gain. Sometimes it's about a genuine but misguided belief that they know what's best, that they have a better understanding of the threats facing the country than the average citizen.
It's a kind of paternalistic attitude like, we know better than you, so trust us. but that can be really dangerous, especially when it comes to issues as consequential as war and peace.
Exactly. And another risk is that this insider's game can lead to a lack of transparency and accountability. If those crucial decisions are being made behind closed doors with limited public input or oversight, it can be really difficult to hold leaders responsible for their actions.
And that lack of accountability can erode public trust in government, making it even harder to have those open and honest debates that are essential for a functioning democracy.
Saunders also points out that the insider's game can create a kind of echo chamber where dissenting voices are silenced or marginalized.
So you end up with a situation where everyone in the room is thinking the same way, reinforcing each other's biases, and potentially leading to disastrous decisions because no one is willing to challenge the prevailing wisdom.
Right, it's like groupthink on a national security scale. And that's especially dangerous when the stakes are so high, like decisions about going to war.
It seems like Saunders is making a case for more open debate, for more diverse perspectives, and for greater public scrutiny of these decisions.
She is. She's not arguing that we need to eliminate elite influence altogether, but she is suggesting that we need to be aware of the potential pitfalls of the insider's game and to have mechanisms in place to mitigate those risks.
Okay, so what are some of those mechanisms? What can we do to ensure greater accountability and transparency in these decisions?
Well, one important step is to strengthen the role of Congress in foreign policy. Saunders suggests that Congress needs to be more assertive in exercising its oversight powers, in demanding information from the executive branch, and in holding hearings and investigations to scrutinize the administration's actions.
It's about restoring that balance of power, ensuring that the president isn't acting unilaterally, especially when it comes to decisions about war and peace.
Right, and it's also about fostering a culture of dissent, both within the government and in the broader public discourse. We need to encourage people to speak out, to challenge assumptions, and to offer alternative perspectives.
It's about creating a space where it's okay to disagree, even on issues as sensitive as national security.
Exactly, and that requires a certain level of media literacy. We need to be able to critically evaluate the information we're getting from the media, to recognize biases, and to seek out diverse sources of information.
It's about being informed citizens, not just passive consumers, of whatever narrative is being pushed by those in power.
Right, and ultimately it's about demanding more from our leaders. We need to hold them accountable for their decisions, and we need to make it clear that we won't tolerate dishonesty or manipulation, especially when it comes to matters of war and peace.
So the insider's game isn't just an academic exercise. It's a call to action. It's a reminder that even in a system dominated by elite politics, citizens still have a role to play in shaping those critical decisions.
I think that's a great way to sum it up. The book gives us this realistic view of how power works, but it also reminds us that even in a system where elites hold a lot of sway, we're not powerless. We can make a difference, but it requires us to be informed, engaged, and willing to hold our leaders accountable.
Well, this has been a truly insightful deep dive into the insider's game. I have to say, this book has really challenged my assumptions about how these decisions are made.
I completely agree. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the complex interplay of domestic politics and international relations.
And with that, we wrap up our exploration of the insider's game. If you found this conversation as fascinating and thought-provoking as we did, we highly encourage you to pick up the book and delve even deeper into this crucial topic. Happy reading, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.